So this is Easter Sunday. It's the most important Sunday in our church calendar, and that's because it commemorates the most important day in human history. Easter is a story about how restoration triumphs over failure, forgiveness triumphs over disobedience, and grace triumphs over evil. But it's not just a story from the pages of history. It is a true story that continues to be lived out day after day, and the most important story that will impact your life here and now. I'd like to share with you the story of Easter and then explain why it's so important for you and I today. So if you would you please take a Bible and turn to Mark 16. If you don't have a Bible with you, there should be one in the rack in front of you. Mark chapter 16, that's page 829. Page 829, Mark chapter 16. For a good portion of this year as a church, we've been looking at the Gospel of Mark. And so it's fitting that we get to turn to the end of the Gospel of Mark and get to listen to Mark's account of how the resurrection happened. Mark chapter 16, I'm going to begin reading in verse 1. So page 829, Mark 16, verse 1. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him." So 3 women, Mary, and Salome, get up early on the first day of the week, that's Sunday, early in the morning, just before sunrise, and they go to the tomb with spices. The reason they're doing this is the Jews at this time did not embalm dead bodies the way the Egyptians did, for example. And so what the spices were for were to counteract the smell of a body decomposing. Now, Jesus had been crucified late on Friday, and he died Friday evening, and his body was taken down from the cross just as the Sabbath was beginning. And so from Friday evening all day Saturday, these women were not allowed to come and bring spices to the tomb. So early Sunday morning after the Sabbath is over, they get up and make their way to anoint Jesus' body with these spices. Now, in their grief and in their confusion, it doesn't dawn on them until they're on their way towards the tomb. Wait a minute. How are we going to get the stone from in front of the tomb? How are we going to do this? Well, when they arrive, they find that the stone has been already rolled away, and there is an angel from heaven inside the empty tomb. And the angel says to them, "I know you're looking for Jesus the Nazarene. He's not here. He's risen. It's not just that he's no longer dead. He's been raised from the dead, resurrected to new life." That's the story of Easter. To put it in its simplest possible form, Jesus is risen. He is no longer dead. He is alive. He is risen from the dead. Now, why is that story? Why is the truth that Jesus is alive so important for you and for me today? Why is this more than just a story from 2,000 years ago? To understand that, look at the next verse in Mark 16 with me. Verse 7, but go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. And the question is, why is Peter mentioned by name? There are 10 other disciples at this point. None of them are mentioned by name. But the angel very specifically says, go tell the 10 and Peter. Why is Peter picked out by name? Well, we need to remember the last time we saw Peter in the Gospel of Mark. And for this, just glance over, if you're using one of the church Bibles, to the other side of the page, to the left-hand side, to chapter 14, verse 66. As you're glancing back, you're moving back in time just a few days to late Thursday evening of the week in which Jesus is crucified and raised from the dead. That late Thursday evening, as it begins to push into Friday morning, very early Friday morning, in that evening, Jesus has dinner with his disciples. And as a part of that dinner, the Last Supper, he quotes a passage from the Old Testament in which he tells them that he is going to experience betrayal and death, and that all of them, his closest companions, are going to abandon him. Peter speaks up at that moment and says, no, Lord. Even if everyone else were to abandon you, I never will. Peter says to Jesus, look, they may not have the courage to stay with you, but there is nothing that would ever cause me to leave you. And to that point, Peter has been faithful. But Jesus says to him, Peter, before the rooster crows twice, you will have denied me 3 times. Peter says, not going to happen. They finish the meal. They head out of the city down into the Kidron Valley, up into the Garden of Gethsemane. When they arrive, Jesus says to Peter and to James and to John and the other disciples, pray so that you do not fall into temptation. Jesus knows what's coming for Peter. He tells him, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. Pray that you do not give in to this temptation. Pray that you do not fail when the time comes. Jesus himself goes away to pray because he needs strength for this great trial that he's about to experience. Peter, however, falls asleep. He doesn't pray. He doesn't do what Jesus told him to do. He falls asleep. Jesus comes back and wakes him up and he says, look, I'm serious. There is something coming that without prayer you will not make it through. Get up and pray. Peter goes back to sleep. A 3rd time. Finally, Jesus says, the time has come. My betrayer is here. It's time. And Jesus is arrested and led by Roman guards back through the Kidron Valley, back to the city of Jerusalem, to the high priest's house, a man named Caiaphas. Peter is trailing at a distance, watching all of this happen. And when Jesus is taken inside of Caiaphas's house, Peter waits outside in the courtyard. And we pick up the story in Mark 15, verse 66. Mark 14. Verse 66. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said. And he went out into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, "This fellow is one of them." Again, he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know this man you are talking about." Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. This is the moment of Peter's greatest failure. It's an absolute devastating failure. It's not like he did something that he had been told not to do years ago. He was told this was coming. He was warned just a few hours earlier. It's not like he ended up doing something that he didn't know better than to do. It's not like he had forgotten something God told him a long time ago. Jesus had been very specific with him. There is going to come a temptation in which you are going to be tempted to deny me. And Jesus tells him, pray so you do not fall into that temptation. And Peter has resolved, I will not give way. And just a few hours later, he has failed miserably. The thing he promised he wouldn't do, the thing he swore he wouldn't do. In the moment, he called down curses and swore he didn't know Jesus at all. It's a devastating failure. But we know something about this failure, don't we? If we're honest with ourselves. Some of us in this room, we made a promise, a vow. We were not going to have sex before marriage. Then we turned around and did the very thing we said we weren't going to do. Some of us vowed we were not going to repeat our parents' mistakes and allow divorce to tear our family apart. And then we turned around and did the very thing we said we weren't going to do. Some of us have vowed we were not going to allow money to become an idol in our life. We had seen too many lives destroyed that way. And then we turned around and let it happen. Some of us have promised that our job was not going to be more important than our family. And we woke up one day and realized we did that very thing. Some of us have said, no more is food going to be an idol in my life. No more is the refrigerator going to control my behavior. No more is the scale going to define how I feel about myself. And no sooner are those words out of our mouth than we fall back into the very thing we said we weren't going to do. Some of us, convicted to the core about lust, have sworn off pornography and said, never again. Only within a few hours to fall back into the thing we said we weren't going to do. Some of us have promised that we were no longer going to allow other people to define our identity and their opinions of us to determine how we feel about ourselves. We fall back into the exact same trap we said we weren't going to do. Some of us have promised we were going to do a better job of getting along with our siblings and obeying our parents. And no sooner did we say that than we did the exact opposite. It's failure. It's disobedience. It's not stuff we didn't know we weren't supposed to do. It's stuff that we promised we weren't going to do. It's stuff that we had decided, that's not for me. And we failed just as spectacularly as Peter did. Why does the angel say, but go tell his disciples and Peter? Why is Peter singled out by name? It's because it's Easter Sunday. Now, please understand what this means. It doesn't just mean that Jesus has died for Peter's sins and so he's forgiven. That is true, and that's very important. But that's the good news of Good Friday. This is Easter Sunday, and there's more to it than that. What's more to it is the angel says on Jesus' orders, go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. The good news of Easter is that this man Jesus, who Peter denied, this man Jesus who Peter spectacularly failed, this man Jesus who was crucified on Friday is today alive, and that this same person is going to meet Peter in Galilee and restore him. Not just that he's going to give him a system of doctrinal beliefs or a religion that he can know his sins are forgiven, but that a real person is going to meet him in Galilee at the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and he is going to embrace him and forgive him and restore him. The good news of Easter is that Jesus is alive, and Peter, he's coming for you. Not to judge you, not to destroy you, but to forgive you and to love you and to bless you. The good news of Easter is not a system of beliefs. The good news of Easter is not a religion. The good news of Easter is there is a person who is God over all things. And Peter, he loves you too much to leave you in your failure and your disobedience and your sin. And when you get to Galilee, Peter, Jesus is going to be there on the shore cooking some fish waiting for you. So too some of us this morning. We may not yet be Christians. We may not yet be believers in Jesus. The good news of Easter is not that Jesus has been risen and that thousands of people this morning get to hear that, and millions of people and billions of people. The good news of Easter is that Jesus this morning is calling you by name. Yes, go and tell that there are thousands of people that Jesus has written, but John, James, Susan, Avery, Jesus is risen for you. That you need to understand this is a person who in the midst of your failures and your doubts and your sins and your disobedience sees you and will not leave you there. And that he's calling you this morning by name to restore you, to forgive you, to give you life. It's not just Peter. There are three other people who are named in Mark 16. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. These three women come to the tomb. They are, now catch this, the very first people in human history to become Christians. You realize that? Three women show up at the tomb. The tomb is empty. They know that Jesus is not in there. They can see it for themselves. Unless they miss the point, there is an angel from heaven who says to them, Jesus is risen. And they believe him. They're not like, no, you got him in here somewhere. Let us see him. No. They actually believe, which makes these three women the first Christians in human history, the first people to have heard the news that Jesus is risen and to believe it. And what happens? The angel says to them, go and tell. Go and tell. Now, if you've been with us as we've gone through the Gospel of Mark, or if you've read the Gospel of Mark, you may realize that throughout the Gospel of Mark, there have been lots of times where people have wanted to go and tell and Jesus won't let them. They're wanting to go tell, and Jesus says, no, the story's not done yet. It's not time to tell. Do they listen? No, they go out and tell anyway. Now, finally, the story is done. Finally, the resurrection has happened, and so the angel not only tells them it's okay to go tell, he actually orders them to go do it. It's a command from Jesus himself. Go and tell Peter and the other disciples. And what do these women do? Verse 8. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. The very first Christians in human history, the very first people who hear that Jesus is raised from the dead, the very first people who believe that he is no longer dead, what is the very first act that they do? Disobedience. Disobedience. A direct command. Go tell. Is their failure any less spectacular? Here's the crazy thing. We can say about Peter before the resurrection, well, Jesus hasn't been raised from the dead yet. He doesn't fully understand. These women are the very first Christians, and the very first Christian act in human history is disobedience and failure and fear. You see, we think that once you come to believe that Jesus is raised from the dead, that there'll be no more fear. We think that, hey, if you just become a Christian, it's going to be okay. Is that what happens? Here these women are petrified and terrified, and their fear does to them the same thing that it did to Peter. It leads to disobedience. The last act before the crucifixion, disobedience. The first act after the resurrection, disobedience. Some of us know this as well. We are Christians. We've accepted Jesus as Savior. And we've heard him say to us, don't be anxious about anything. And then we turn around and we not only give in to anxiety, we meditate on it. We've heard Jesus say to us, hey, you need to sell this and give that possession to the poor. And we pretend we didn't hear him. Jesus says things to us like, go tell your friend about me, and we get afraid and we say nothing to anybody. We hear Jesus say to us, stop treating your children or your spouse or the people around you with anger. And we go ahead and do it anyway. For some of us, our greatest failures have come after the resurrection, after we believed in Jesus. So it is with these women. But the amazing thing about Jesus, the good news of Easter, is not just that the cross paid for those sins. The good news of Easter is the same Jesus who's going to appear to Peter to restore him. Literally in about a half hour or an hour from this moment, will appear to these women, to Mary Magdalene, and do the exact same thing for her. She's having trouble obeying, so he appears to her to restore her. The good news of Easter is not a system of beliefs. The good news of Easter is not the truth that you can have your sins forgiven. The good news of Easter is that Jesus is alive. And in the midst of our failure and our sin and our blatant disobedience, blatant failure, that thing where you're cut to the heart and you're like, why can I not stop doing this? This thing where you're humiliated and embarrassed, is this still a part of my life? In the midst of that failure, in the midst of that disobedience, when God tells you something so specifically and you so spectacularly do the opposite, in the midst of that failure, this man, Jesus, comes and finds us and restores us and forgives us and embraces us and loves us. And that when we try to run the other direction, he runs faster. When we try to plug our ears, a person with a voice speaks louder into our ears. The good news of Easter is not a book with a bunch of rules. The good news of Easter is Jesus is alive. And he will not leave you or me in our failures, in our disobedience, and in our sin. And whether you've not yet believed in the resurrection or you have believed in the resurrection and then messed up, it doesn't matter. Jesus is pursuing you in love. You can run away from a religion. You can run away from a system of beliefs. You can't run away from a person who loves you too much to let you go. And the reason Mark ends his gospel this way is because what Peter did, Jesus restored. What these women did, Jesus restored. And the reason he ends this way is because the story is continuing today. Did you not hear it in the baptisms? Those are stories of a living person pursuing those that he loves despite failure, disobedience, and sin. The story continues. Why is the news that Jesus has risen so important for you and for me? Is because whether you're not yet a Christian or whether you are a Christian, in our failures, in our disobedience, in our fear, in our rejection, a living person comes and finds us. And no matter what we've done, he whispers in our ear, I love you and I forgive you. And that if you've known this kind of spectacular failure like I have, when the God of the universe picks you up out of that pit, and when he dusts you off and embraces you, then you realize this is the good news of Easter. He went and found Peter and restored him. He appeared to these women and restored them. He's appeared to the people in the baptism this morning and restored them. And the good news of Easter is he's waiting to do that for you. And that if you hear his voice in your heart, he's not talking about the masses. He's calling you by name. Peter, Mary, Salome. It's a living person who loves you too much to leave you in your failure and your disobedience and your sin. Christ is risen.